people need the opportunity to be good at something. So then you might ask yourself, well, what's the best antidote to the discomfort of life? And you might say, well, it's comfort. And I suppose that's what you act out when you swaddle a baby. But a better antidote is something like adventure to excellence. And that's far better antidote to suffering than the mere absence of suffering. Not to say that the mere absence of suffering, that's not nothing. Yeah, well, that's the difficulty of maturity. The Freudians said very wisely that the good mother necessarily fails. It means she stops providing the comfort that insulates people against the need for adventure. And that's exemplified best in, well, the best portrayal of that I've seen is Michelangelo's Pieta. It's a statue of Mary, and she has Christ's body on her, as an adult, on her lap, and he's broken and destroyed. And, she's displaying that. That's the bravery of a mother, to allow that to happen. But not only that, to facilitate it. Away you go. Well, why? It's dangerous out there. It's like, yeah, no kidding. It's more dangerous here if you stay with me by a lot. So you might lose your body out there in the world, but if you stay here, you lose your soul. Carl Jung was very interested in the Oedipal complex, and that's basically the overprotective maternal. And he criticized Freud for presuming that it was really something the mother did. He said it's more relational than that. First of all, it would be something the father would allow to happen, assuming there was a father around. So let's not forget about the paternal contribution to allowing that to occur. Because in some sense, it's the father's role to serve as the antithesis of that maternal overprotection. So a woman is extremely bonded with her infant, say between 0 and 9 months, and the infant is utterly helpless. And so complete compassion and the provision of comfort is the only job that matters. And that's really the case. And then the woman has to switch gears to some degree. The mother has to switch gears as the child starts to become more mobile, fundamentally, and more independent. She has to let go of the infant, which is a real grieving process. And she has to start to facilitate this movement towards independence. But that's a hard shift. And so partly the role of the father in that is to be an advocate for the child's independence and to comfort the mother, to let her know that that degree of security provision is no longer necessary, but also to act as an advocate for the child's outgoing desire. So it's the Oedipal situation is not only the mother, it's also, say, the weak father, but then it's also the child. So you can imagine, because Jung believed that these negotiated agreements were relational. So, you're 6, you're in grade 1, maybe you're feeling a little ill, maybe you're not. Maybe you're playing with being a little ill, and maybe you're playing with exaggerating how ill you are, and your mom comes downstairs and says, you've got a test today at school. Maybe you haven't quite prepared for it. Maybe you should have. And she says, you seem to have a tummy ache. Maybe you're too sick to go to school. And the kid thinks, maybe I could just stay home and, mom could tuck me in and I wouldn't have to take that test and I wouldn't have to confront the world. And he says, yeah, mom, my stomach really hurts. And away we go. And the child has made a choice. And that's a catastrophic choice. And you think, well, children shouldn't be held accountable for choices they make at that age. It's like the choice has consequences. And to be held accountable for that is to recognize purely that the choice has consequences and that it is a choice. Now, you could say, well, 95% of the blame is to be put on the mother. And maybe that's an overestimate. I think it probably is. But the child could say, Mom, you don't have to worry about me. I'm going to get up and go do this. And that's the right choice. So these are always chicken and egg problems, obviously, but that fleshes out the complexity of the situation. If you're being enticed down a pathological road, you can accept or reject the invitation. Some people are better at enticing and some people enforce it more harshly. And, there's all sorts of individual variability in situations like this, but just because you're offered the bait doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it. And I'm not a determinist. I do believe that people have free will, whatever that means. That's a murky subject and it gets complicated the more you look at it, but whatever. It's still a good shorthand way of describing the fact that we seem to be cursed with responsibility for our own destiny, at least to some degree. Every time you make a status shift as you move upwards, of course you have imposter syndrome, because when you first make a transition into a new role, you are an imposter because you're a beginner. You don't know what you're doing. And that doesn't mean you're a liar or a fake. And it doesn't mean you should presume more knowledge than you have. What did Nietzsche say? Every great man is an actor of his own ideal. That feeds into the imposter syndrome in some sense. If you want to move to the next stage, at some point you have to act like you're already there when you're just barely started. And that's not a lie. It can be, and it can degenerate into a lie, especially if you presume more than you know. Let's say you move from being an undergraduate to a graduate student. All the other graduate students and the professors know that you're just a beginning graduate student. They're not going to expect as much from you as they would from a more seasoned graduate student. You have some leeway that's genuine, but you are, the low-rung occupier of that role. And of course you're going to feel like you're an imposter if you have any sense, because you're just barely there. You just made the transition. That's okay. That's not a problem. First of all, you have to understand that everyone with any sense who isn't narcissistic feels that. And it's actually an indication of your mental health and your competence, as long as that doesn't become crippling. It shouldn't knock you out. I'm such a phony. Well, don't be a phony. That's the first thing. If you're dealing with competent people and you admit your ignorance, the competent people never judge you harshly for that, as long as you've been paying attention. So in my classes, for example, people were often afraid to ask questions. And so sometimes I would point to people and ask them if they had a question, especially the quieter types. And they'd be afraid to ask the question because, they're revealing their ignorance. And they would assume they're the only person in the room that's that ignorant, but they're not, because if they were paying attention and they had a question, the probability that half the class had that question was really high. It's different if you're not paying attention. You can be an ignorant newbie, and you can even ask the questions that are necessary to ask in that position and sort of reveal your inadequacy. And as long as you're dealing with competent people and you've been paying attention, they're just going to answer your questions. And then you only have to be ignorant once. That's the thing about asking a stupid question. You only have to ask it once. Then you're no longer stupid. Well, if you're competent, you're more what you don't know. And so you're always asking questions. You see someone else asking questions, you think, oh, you're asking questions. You probably are competent. Becoming more articulate, that's the primary array of weapons. So, physical prowess is something, and it's not nothing, that physical confidence that comes along with that as well. But the same thing replicated at the level of the ability to communicate and to think, that's way broader field of battle and opportunity. So this is one thing that isn't taught well, especially to boys. It's more important to teach it to boys, I would say, because they're more skeptical of the educational enterprise in general, partly because they're less obedient, partly because they're less agreeable. That's particularly true for disagreeable boys. And agreeable boys get higher grades independent of their IQ and their academic achievement, because they're easier to deal with. So what do you tell disagreeable boys? There's nothing that makes you more formidable than verbal competence, than being able to articulate, be able to think, to marshal your arguments, right? Battlefield metaphor. Get everything in order, all your information straight, to marshal your forces. And so, that's part of the reason that rap artists are so popular, especially among disaffected young men, black and white alike, because they're unbelievably articulate. Like, they have this incredible verbal prowess. It's unbelievably attractive, and it's associated with genuine artistic and redemptive activity, often focusing on something that's approximately the voice of the underclass, let's say, but a powerful voice, right? And it's interesting to see how many young white guys identify with that. If you're a young man, you still feel alienated from your place as rightful heir of the proper kingdom. That's an existential truism for everyone, particularly for every young man, because he is an outsider in many ways. He's young and juvenile and not very highly valued, and is in some sense hurt by the inadequacies of the current king, the current culture, and is easily turned against it because of that. And that's the machinations of the evil uncle. That's the King Arthur story. That's the story of Horus and Osiris. It's an ancient story. It's the story of Sauron, and it's there all the time. And you see in rap music, in hip hop, all of that alienation being given an articulated voice in an artistic sense. And that's a good example of the power of verbal facility. And that's the route to, let's say, marketing education to young men. It's like, you want to take your rightful place in the kingdom? It's like, get your tongue straight, man. Get it under control. In the highest possible sense, you're trapped by the charisma of that. And that charisma, that's not nothing. That's a signal of something redemptive occurring. That accounts for virtually all of the attraction of hip hop and rap. It's the articulated voice of the struggling but worthy underclass. I suppose that's a good way of putting it. And so that verbal prowess is one of the ways they struggle up towards the light. That's a good example of that, of having that danger under control, because it's a dark genre in many ways, right? There's a real undercurrent and air of violence that surrounds that and its culture, like the punk movement in the UK back in the late 70s. Same sort of thing. That capacity to express that in a poetic manner, in a compelling manner. Johnny Rotten was great at that. He was so intense. He worked with PIL afterwards. He has a song called Rise, which I used to show my clients all the time when I was starting assertiveness training with them. I'd put on Johnny Rotten's Rise, and John Lydon, man, he could channel that like almost no one I've ever seen. He'd get that anger built up inside him, and then it was completely under control, and he expressed it in his music, and he's absolutely captivating, unbelievably charismatic, and I really liked his music. Dostoevsky said that every man was responsible for everything he did and for everything that everyone else does. It's true in a certain sense. You do have an indefinite responsibility, and you do have an indefinite capacity to bear that responsibility, but that doesn't mean it can't be crushing. Then I would say the antidote to that is that you're not in this alone. As your responsibilities mount and your opportunities increase, you have to delegate. It's important that you do everything you can, but there's enough for everyone to do. And so you might say, well, the heroic path is one that leads to universal redemption, and that's true. And you might say, well, that's all on you. It's like, it is in a sense, but then it can be unsustainable, right? You can torture yourself for not doing it well enough. And it is up to you, but it's not up to you alone. It's not up to you alone. So you delegate. You help build people around you. They're all working in the same direction. It's an effort multiplier in any case. And you make sure that they get credit. Credit's good enough. It's not exactly right. The rewards are in accordance with their efforts. And you can distribute that, because there's also a narcissism that can come along with that, which is, well, it's all up to me. And even if you're working in a very competent manner, it can seem that way, but there's plenty of work to go around. And there's plenty of credit where credit is due. And so what you do as you attain more responsibility and opportunity is you delegate more of that. And you do that continually. I mean, one of the roles of a good manager is to make him or herself irrelevant. If you're not a good manager, if your company would collapse if you disappeared, that should all be delegated out. And it's not because you're abdicating responsibility, because also what happens is that if you can routinize something and parse it off to someone else, say, here's a little kingdom for you, and it doesn't have to be little, and it's something that can grow, but here's a kingdom for you, well, then you can go off and do the next thing you need to do, which is extremely important. And you might think there's a kingdom and then it's broken into little kingdoms, and so the farther you are down the hierarchy, the smaller the kingdom you get. But that's only true if you think the world's a zero-sum game, because you could also think of it as a place with an indefinite number of the largest kingdoms possible. Why do we think this is exhaustible in some sense, what we're doing? It doesn't look exhaustible. That's the limits to growth mentality. It's like economists don't believe in that, because they think, well, no, we can just get more efficient, which we certainly are. We're way more efficient than we once were. And those gains in efficiency, when they're not being interfered with, are increasing at more than an arithmetic rate. There are elements of life that have a zero-sum element. I mean, if you're competing with another man, for example, to marry a particular woman, that's a zero-sum game. Think of the game as including you two and that woman. So you can set up circumstances that are zero-sum. Take that metaphor of zero-sum game, where there has to be winners and losers because there's a finite number of resources, is to assume that the rules of that game are the rules that govern the set of all games. And that's just not true. Games are infinitely multipliable. I mean, you can invent a new game. People do that all the time. The man who invented Catan, which is a game I really like to play, it's a very popular board game. That didn't exist until he invented it. Now, thousands and thousands of people play it, and he made a fortune from it. It's like that game never existed. There doesn't seem to be any limit to the number of games we can invent. It's a complicated problem because we are on a single planet, and some resources are more zero-sum than others, but we haven't really run into any actual zero-sum limits in terms of our, the probability of us living an abundant life on the planet. We've stewarded some resources very stupidly. We've done a very bad job of managing oceanic production, for example. Fish farms have alleviated that. on the production side to some degree. And we have to be smart about our resources, but that doesn't mean there's zero sum. And certainly doesn't mean the world is a zero-sum game. And that's a Malthusian idea, that population will grow till it consumes all available resources and precipitously collapse. And then why do we think apocalyptically? It's, because things do come to sudden ends. People die, people get fatal illnesses, like the world you so carefully constructed can be blown apart at any moment by a random occurrence, genetic mutation that causes the cancer that kills you. Life has a fundamentally apocalyptic aspect. And we do understand that because we're self-conscious, and then it's very difficult not to apply that kind of apocalyptic reasoning to things as such. The world's going to burn up. The climate's too hot. What about runaway positive feedback loops? Because that's what the climate types are afraid of. How do we bind our apocalyptic thinking? That's a good question, man. That's a good question. We do that with the truth. That's how we do it. Through dialogue, through investigation, through exploration, through discipline, all of that. The Logos is the antidote to the apocalypse. Of course, that's central Christian dogma, isn't it? That the Logos is the antidote to the apocalypse. Fancy that. And so what does that mean? Well, love and truth is the antidote to the apocalypse. Not the planet has too many people on it. There's an old idea that God is the sum of all that's good. I don't think sum is exactly the right metaphor. It's more like, imagine there are eternal verities: truth, beauty, justice, love, courage, fortitude, compassion. Think of all those things as virtues. So virtue is what all virtues have in common. Virtue is what all virtues have in common. That's the relationship of God to the good. God is the essence of the good. Well, we put that aside for a moment. Well, you may think, how would that manifest itself in your life? Well, that might be pursuit of the good. And that's the pursuit of the good that unites all proximal goods. Well, what is that exactly? Well, it's something like the belief that it would be for the best that all things flourish to the degree that that's possible. When I was a clinician, I thought of that as the good in me serving the best in my clients. And I think the desire for that to happen, that's love. So that's the desire for, you say, well, you take a human, bent, broken, miserable, malevolent, hurt, corrupt, weak, pathetic, contemptible, frustrating, disappointing, all of those things that we can lay on ourselves because of our inadequacies. It's like, it's easy to dismiss that. And part of that dismissal is what drives the notion that the planet has too many people on it and that we're a cancer on the face of the earth. It's not easy to love that. But what do you want? You want the broken people to rise up out of their brokenness rather than despise them for it. And then you orient yourself towards that and try to pull that out of people and yourself. And you have to have that frame first. That's what you're aiming for. And maybe that would be the opposite of hell. This is one thing I would say that unites Sam Harris and I, despite our differences in belief in some sense at the level of detail. Sam is very acutely aware of the reality of malevolence and hell. Now, he wouldn't frame that metaphysically or religiously, but it doesn't really matter. He is doing his best to aim away from that as hard as he possibly can. I didn't realize till the last time I talked to him that Sam identified the religious tradition, the dogmatic religious tradition, with the totalitarianism that produces atrocity. Now, I think that's a misidentification. The same way the Marxists blame inequality on capitalism. Inequality is really a problem, but it's not the fault of capitalism. And totalitarian atrocity is really a problem. But to identify that reflexively with religion or even with religious dogma, that's a mistake. Dogma, maybe, but even that's tricky because what's the difference between dogma and knowledge? Today's knowledge is tomorrow's dogma. Drawing the line between those two is extremely difficult. You can't just abandon everything you think, even though it's arbitrary. You need it to guide you. And it can transform into totalitarian dogma and promote atrocity in the servants of its no longer valid maintenance. But that's a very complicated problem. Well, so we're having this conversation, and let's say I want this conversation to go the best way it can possibly go. Okay, well, I don't know what that way is, but I have to want that to begin with. So I come to the conversation. I think I'm going to try to have the most engaging conversation that I can have. I'm going to say what I believe to be the case during the conversation. There isn't something I want from you, except that hopefully we can meet in that endeavor. And then you think, well, whatever we accomplish in the course of a genuine dialogue is for the best. And that's to let go of the tiller. And truth does that. It's like, because you can't craft the outcome. And so what you're doing by engaging in truthful dialogue is letting the wind blow where it's going to blow. And you do that if you've decided at some fundamental level, even if you don't know you've decided that the truth will set you free. And the truth is what is, in the final analysis, redemptive. We tend to think that truth resides in a set of accurate facts. That's actually the weakness, I would say, of the materialistic atheist position, that axiomatic presumption about the nature of the truth. But the truth is a process. It's something like that. True truth is to be found in the search for the truth. That's the process that continually revitalizes things. And then if your orientation is towards the good, to the degree that your orientation is towards the good, and your belief that the good can prevail, which is an article of faith, right? The good can prevail. It's like, what's your evidence for that? There's evidence for whatever position you want to hold on that. So it's a decision. And you let go and the truth takes you away. And you think that it's going to go where it should go. Commit yourself to that idea. And then that's your adventure. That's one of the things that's so cool about that. It's like, you need this adventure to buttress you against tragedy. There's nothing more adventurous than the truth. And in fact, it's the only true adventure, obviously. You just have to think that through for 20 minutes. How could it be a true adventure if it wasn't true? And then why is an adventure if it's true? Because you're not crafting the outcome. And so what does that mean? It means you've decided that the truth is what will set you free. And that's independent in some sense of the evidence. One of the things my family has learned, this has taken a lot of learning, is that there's been at least, I would say, 50 times in the last 5 years where we thought we'd be taken out by what was happening around us. Sometimes those were big things. There was probably 10 of them, like they were public and famous. And then there was like 40 things that weren't so big, but were still plenty big. And it was always the same thing. It was hot as hell for weeks, but flipped, always. But that doesn't mean it was pleasant to live through the part when it wasn't flipping. It was horrible. So far, we've been able to let go of the tiller and let the waves take us where they'll take us and not flip the boat, right? I mean, there's always parts of yourself that you can overcome. And so that's William James' moral equivalent to war, essentially. Now, if you need something to grapple with, and you probably do, you can find that. You just look inside, you'll find something to grapple with. Inadequacy, weakness, susceptibility to temptation, narcissism, pride, envy, revenge, resentment, frustration, lack of faith, all of that. That'll keep you occupied if you really grapple with it. And yeah, I mean, that's an ancient theological question. What's up with the devil? Why does the possibility of evil exist? Why is there an eternal adversary? You see that reflected in Cain and Abel, right? At the beginning of the Genesis stories, essentially. The first two human beings are good set against an adversary. And that's what opens history, that story. You think, well, why would God construct a reality where an adversary exists? And maybe it's because all things considered, a world with an adversary is a better world, just like a garden with a snake in it is a better garden. These things aren't easy to understand. No snake, no necessity to contend with snakes. So why be awake at all? No adversary, no challenge. Why be challenged? Because maybe you're better for the challenge. And maybe that's the challenge, to see if you can be better for the challenge. Well, if it isn't, you'll find it externally, because you'll demonize someone to turn them into Satan so that you can find an adversary. And then that's very unfortunate for you and for them. You battle with someone external who's malevolent, let's say, or you think they are, and usually you've got that mostly wrong, but not always. But if the battle is inside, which is where it's supposed to be, most fundamentally, then it is the ultimate challenge. It's the eternal game, is the notion that that sacred battle is fundamentally spiritual, which is to say, in some sense, fundamentally psychological. It's to be fought on the battleground of the soul, internally. It's a subjective issue. How do you defeat evil? You defeat the evil in your own heart. That is how you do it. And so if that's all being acted out for you in the world, well, you've misplaced Satan. That's a good way of thinking about it. This is another weakness, I think, of the atheistic position, because it's easy in some sense to dispense with belief in the highest good, but it's not so easy to dispense with belief in evil. So that's a big problem. So then where do you localize it? And you can find evidence of it everywhere, certainly in institutions. I mean, that's the whole systemic racism, corrupt patriarchy narrative, is that Satan is to be found at the core of our institutions. And to some degree, that's true. because everything we do is corrupt to some degree. And so then do you fight it sociologically? You're the good person and the institution is Satan? You're so good, are you? You're so sure of that, are you? You've got everything in order, or do you? And you might say, well, do you have to have everything in order before you fight evil on the sociological front? And the answer is, well, no, because you're never going to have everything in order, but you still shouldn't put the cart before the horse. It's a spiritual battle. And it's taken people thousands and thousands of years to figure this out. Now, first of all, it was the snake. What's evil? What's malevolent? The predatory reptile. Fair enough, man. I mean, we've been fighting with predatory reptiles for 60 million years as mammals. 60 million years. So it's a good first pass approximation. It's the snake, the poisonous snake, the external enemy, the predator. Well, what about the predator and other people? Oh yeah, that's even worse, man. It's like predators are one thing, but predatory people, other tribes, man, they're brutal. They're brutal. Well, what about your predatory friend? Oh, that's pretty bad too. The friend who stabs you in the back, the person who betrays you, Judas. God, maybe that's the ultimate snake. Well, how about when you betray yourself? Oh, yeah. See, there's this association that's very strange that occurred in the development of Christian thought between the snake in the Garden of Eden and Satan. There's no indication in the original story that the snake has anything to do with the Lord of all evil. It's a very weird conclusion that's been drawn. It's almost extra biblical because there's almost no mention of Satan in the Bible at all, much less any direct connection between the serpent and Satan. It's a very, very strange idea. But it's part of this psychologization of evil. Like, well, what's the ultimate predator? What's the ultimate predator? What's the enemy you harbor in your own heart who hates you? That's the ultimate predator. There's these images of Mary with her head in the stars and baby in her arms and her foot on a snake. Like, well, that's the eternal feminine. Her head's in the stars because she's oriented towards the highest good and she's protecting her infant from predators. That could be an actual predator. That's been the case throughout not just human history, but mammalian history. Could be other people who are predators. Could be men who are predators. Could be her who's a predator, the devouring mother. What's the ultimate locale of genuine evil? Well, the highest religious answer is, that's in you. That's the proper place to battle it out. And I think that's true. It's literally and metaphorically true. I was convinced of that in part because of Solzhenitsyn's writings, because Solzhenitsyn identified the totalitarian state with the willingness of the subjects of that state, the subjects and the perpetrators at the same time, to live by lies. And every time you lie in support of the totalitarian state, then you're the perpetrator. And that's a psychological issue. It's like, you're going to lie to get along or not? Say, well, what does it matter? I'll go along with it. It's okay. We'll see how it matters. Because it matters. And that's all a psychodrama as far as I'm concerned. Fundamentally, when it's properly placed. I had a rule with my clients because, you might say, well, I've gone halfway down this path and I found out it's wrong. So how do you distinguish that from just giving up? Well, that's a really hard question, right? It's a moral hazard because it's inappropriate to continue in a direction you now realize to be wrong. But it's also inappropriate to give up and use that rationalization as an excuse. So that is genuinely a moral hazard. So one of the principles that I tried to abide by in my therapeutic discussions was, you can change course as long as the next thing you do is equally or more difficult, because that's a check against just giving up. You want to discipline yourself so you can get yourself organized so that you can go in a particular direction, so that when you find the right direction, you can really go in that direction. And that does require an apprenticeship of sorts. It might not matter in some sense exactly what the apprenticeship is, as long as it is rigorous, right? And so that's sort of a bridge between moral relativism and moral absolutism. There's lots of games you can play. It's not that obvious a priori which is the best game. So that's kind of a morally relative stance. There's multiple playable games. But then the absolute is, but you have to play one of them. You have to learn to play one of them. You have to become an expert at least one of them. And then that's not a relative proposition. I believe that's true. That seems to me to be the case. So you want to commit to something. When you commit to something, you require yourself to bring all of your disparate components moving in a single direction, united in a single direction. So it's a unifying act. And then once having been unified, well, then you can bring that unity to bear on a variety of different tasks. But you have to bring it together first.